Welcome back to the third hour of our program. On the line with us is investigative journalist Mike Rothschild. He's got a new book out. He specializes in conspiracy theories and whatnot, and has been a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and elsewhere. His new book is The Storm is Upon Us, How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Or at least it's new out in paperback with a new wrap-up chapter there toward the end. Mike, welcome to the program, or welcome back to the program. But you've been on our program before.
I have. Thank you. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, thank you. QAnon, burst on the scene a few years ago, and when we had the pizza shop getting shot up and all this kind of weird stuff, and then it kind of became like, okay, this fringy nutball thing, they're waiting for JFK to return, at the age of 100 or something, or his son anyway. And now you're writing over at the New York Times and also in your book that, you think QAnon is gone, or you think it's become like the Moonies, it's a little cult that you occasionally run across, but really the ideas that animate it, or the ideas that it has brought into the public sphere, have integrated themselves pretty aggressively, pretty firmly into the GOP. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So the actual QAnon movement, as we've understood it from October 2017, when the first Q drops showed up, up until President Biden's inauguration, it really has wound down because it really couldn't do anything else. When you have a prophetic movement based around the President of the United States tweeting that mass arrests are about to be unleashed, and he's not the president, and he doesn't have Twitter, and he doesn't have the power to mass arrest anyone, your movement really has to adapt. So what QAnon has really become is much more of a mythology. The iconography, the branding, the catchphrases, the hashtags, that stuff has started to fall by the wayside. But the ideas of QAnon, the idea of these, pedophile rings running the world, and the election being stolen, and COVID being a hoax, that is now mainstream conservative orthodoxy. So when you have the orthodoxy of your movement is now mainstream, you don't really need the fringe stuff. And in fact, the fringe stuff really tends to repel people much more than it brings people in.
So how do the fathers, as it were, of the GOP, and I use a sexist term intentionally, it's the vast majority of Republican leadership has always been and continues to be male. How are they looking at this? Is it sort of like, back when Nixon decided with his Southern strategy, hey, let's bring in the Southern white racists because that'll give us enough people to win elections, and we'll tolerate their disgusting perspectives, or is the leadership of the GOP actually starting to believe that Democrats drink the blood of children?
I don't think the leadership of the GOP really believes that Hillary Clinton is running baby sacrifice rings, or if they do, they don't tend to talk about it quite as much. But what they've had to do is really walk a line between tolerating these people and not pushing them away, but also not really endorsing the most lurid aspects of the movement. So you can say things like, well, I'm not one of those Q people. I'm not crazy. I don't believe there's, pedophile rings running the world, but, the election was stolen, and ivermectin is the cure for everything, and COVID was created in a Ukrainian biolab. Those are the ideas of QAnon. You're just not endorsing the really weird, really fringy parts of it. Even though a lot of your base believes that stuff, you have enough people who don't believe it, and you don't really want the bad press of it either. So you're walking a line between not pushing it away, but not tacitly approving of it either.
Now, QAnon started on one of these message boards, 4chan, 8chan, et cetera. But it seems, from what I've read, and certainly when I was writing my book on Big Brother, I read several books about social media, and one in particular about Facebook, suggesting that social media generally, and Facebook specifically, played a huge role in the rise of QAnon. Is that the case, and is that still the case?
Yes, social media really was the birthplace of QAnon. Now, of course, conspiracy theories have existed long before social media, the internet, computers, electricity. But Q itself is a movement based around sharing. It's a movement of sharing memes, decoding of Q drops, videos, books, articles. Without the kind of community that social media fosters, I don't think that Q really would have taken off because it is so fringe. It's so weird. You didn't have meetups of Q people. You didn't have these rallies and conferences that you have now. For a long time, a meetup of Q people in the flesh was 8 people at an Applebee's. Now, of course, it's 5,000 people at a mega church screaming about how Joe Biden's a fake president. So without social media, and really without the tolerance of social media companies allowing this stuff to fester and not stepping in because they didn't want to be seen as censoring or canceling or being unfair to conservatives, I don't think Q really would have taken off in the way that it did.
Which brings us to the obvious next question, which is assuming that this conspiracy theory or this collection of conspiracy theories that have now been integrated into the Republican Party are not good or healthy things for our republic or for the individuals who get sucked into them, what do we as a society, what do we as a culture, what do we as government do about it, and what are the social media companies doing about it?
Well, the social media companies finally cracked down on QAnon and some of the related iconography, but a lot of it took place after January 6th. There was a Twitter crackdown of QAnon in July of 2020, and about 70,000 accounts were suspended. But they found ways around it. They ban evaded using misspelled hashtags. They created new accounts. They would go to places like Gab or Parler and tell everybody what their new account was because they want to be on mainstream social media. That's where the debates are. That's where the liberals are that they can argue with. That's where new converts are going to be. But what we can do about it as a society is almost nothing, because this is a very difficult problem to deal with at scale. Where we really have to deal with it is in our own lives, in our own families, in our friend groups. And when we see somebody that we care about posting articles about how COVID's a hoax, Biden's a fake president, Jews run the world with their pedophile rings, all the classic stuff, that's where we have to step in as people. But I think looking to certainly the big social media companies, looking to government to deal with this, I think these are problems that these major entities are just beginning to really grapple with. We have to fight these battles ourselves in our own lives.
You know, I don't think most people realize how pernicious this stuff is and what the consequences can be. Back in the 80s, I lived in Germany for a year. I was working with an international relief agency that was headquartered out of Germany. And the guy who was the head of the agency was a soldier in Hitler's army, and one of my colleagues who I worked with had been in the Hitler Youth. And while the guy who was the leader of the organization had completely renounced anti-Semitism altogether, or anything even close to it, the guy that I worked with, had been indoctrinated in the protocols of the Elders of Zion as a 14-year-old, and still believed it. I mean, this was still widespread and is around the world. This theory, of this blood libel against Jews, that is also part of this. Why is there not more focus on that? That was Hitler's major shtick when he basically, turned Germany into a death camp.
Right. And, Hitler and the propaganda machine, they got it from a previous generation of propagandists.
That's right.
They got it from
the Russian Tsar's
Sure.
intelligence service.
Sure. And this stuff is extremely durable. It works. It hooks people in because it gives you something to blame for your problems. It gives you a scapegoat. It explains to you why things are the way they are, who did it, and what you can do about it. And if you have a propagandistic movement, whether it's the protocols or whether it's QAnon, and it gives you those things, it says, here is who to blame for your problems. Here is what we can do about it. That is always going to be alluring. And it feels like as soon as we catch up to the current generation of propaganda, there's already another generation that incorporates the stuff that came before it, adds in new tricks, new techniques, new technology, and we're dealing with that one, and we never really dealt with the first one. So all of this stuff builds one on top of the other, and it creates a universe where here are the enemies, here are the good people, here's what we can do about it. And now with social media, you can connect with different groups of these people in not just in your town, but other parts of your country and other parts of the world. And it is incredibly pernicious.
Are we seeing any, you said Facebook had been, and Twitter had been cracking down on this, but that it's bounced back. How pervasive is this now still on social media, these theories?
It's not as pervasive in places like Facebook and Twitter, but it is everywhere on TikTok. If you go onto TikTok and find any kind of conspiracy that you want, you'll find thousands, tens of thousands of videos. You'll find videos with anti-Semitic tropes, QAnon, anti-vaccine tropes. And these platforms are really struggling to keep up with it. It will always adapt to new technology, will always adapt to the way that people are communicating with each other. Conspiracy theories were one of the earliest adopters to the internet, one of the earliest adopters to the printing press. They will always be a step ahead of everybody else in disseminating their theories and their nonsense on new tech.
We got a hell of a job ahead of us here. Mike Rothschild, the author of the book, The Storm is Upon Us, How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Mike, thanks a lot for dropping by. It's great having you on the program again.